Welcome to the Blackstone Intelligence Report. I'm Jake Morphonios. The government of Ukraine is one of the most corrupt governments in the world. First, they had a couple of corrupt, U.S.-backed, anti-Russian puppet presidents. But then the pendulum swung the other way, and Russia helped to get a pro-Russian puppet installed. His name was Yanukovych. He got elected. But the USA didn't like that guy, so the CIA helped to orchestrate a coup that sent Yanukovych fleeing for his life to Russia, and the USA helped to install yet another pro-West, pro-NATO puppet president, a guy named Poroshenko. Well, it turned out that Poroshenko was a dirty, rotten, corrupt dirtbag, too. All throughout these years, the government of Ukraine has remained in a state of abject corruption, with nearly all the politicians taking bribes from one sinister oligarch or another. And the corruption was so endemic that one of Ukraine's most popular TV shows, was called Servant of the People, was a comedy about a school teacher who goes on a rant about political corruption. It gets recorded and it goes viral, and the people decide, hey, what the hell, let's make this guy president. And that's kind of the general premise of the show. Well, to their credit, the Ukrainian people in real life knew that they had to try to clean up their government. So they decided, what the hell, let's take the actor who starred in Servant of the People and make him the real president of the country, and we'll just see what happens. And so that's how a Jewish comedian named Volodymyr Zelensky, a guy with no political experience, became the president of Ukraine in 2019. Now, hey, before you say, well, that's just ridiculous, just remember it could have been worse. Instead of electing a comedian pretending to be a politician as president, the people could have elected a reality TV star who pretends to be an intelligent businessman as our president. And it wasn't just Zelensky himself that the Ukrainian people backed. They also imitated the Servant of the People TV show plot by creating a real-life political party called Servant of the People. And Ukrainian voters almost completely swept out their parliament. They swept it clean of its existing corrupt cabal of politicians. They replaced about 70 to 80% of the parliament with brand new representatives, people who had never served in office before and therefore were not corrupted, they weren't compromised. Now, one of these newly elected parliament members was a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington kind of guy. His name was Misha Gurin. Well, Gurin gave an interview recently to an American journalist about the current state of Ukraine's government in its fight against corruption. According to Gurin, in less than 6 months, the majority of the newly elected members of parliament were already on the take. He said that he and some other parliament members get together frequently for lunches, and they sit there and they laugh and they trade the latest stories of what bribe offers they've received. And he talked about one new member of parliament who was approached by a dirty company, and the boss of this company offered this parliament member $30,000 per month in exchange for this politician giving a speech each month from the parliament floor denouncing this businessman's competitor. So when this parliament member initially refused, the crooked businessman just bumped up his offer, kept bumping it up all the way up to $70,000 per month in bribe offer. Now, I want you to understand the significance of a $70,000 per month bribe. That's $840,000 per year. You know how much a Ukrainian member of parliament earns in a year? Their regular salary? Less than $18,000. It's around $1,500 a month. So this new member of parliament can either choose to keep his integrity and earn about $18,000 a year, or he can pocket a bribe and earn $840,000 a year. Now, Gurin doesn't say in this interview whether or not this particular politician ultimately accepted the bribe or not, but he insists that this kind of corruption is, again, the norm rather than the exception in Ukrainian government. Many of these politicians are shills for oil and gas corporations. Others are shills for the lucrative weapons industries. And that is why you've got neo-Nazi Azov troops in Ukraine who are walking around carrying Tavor rifles that were made by Israel's war industry and paid for with U.S. tax dollars. That's why you've got corrupt Pentagon bureaucrats and compromised U.S. military generals who won't stop sending weapons and armaments to Ukraine that have been made by America's military-industrial complex. The MIC, military-industrial complex. Shilling for the MIC is why, for example, crony Alexander Vindman became a whistleblower after he was on that infamous perfect call where President Trump threatened that unless President Zelensky opened a corruption investigation into Trump's competitor, Joe Biden, Trump would withhold further funding for Ukraine to buy more weapons. Shilling for the MIC is why Vindman is on talk show circuits right now, warning of this huge imminent war and calling for a major increase in weapon deliveries from American war corporations to Ukraine. Shilling for the MIC is why bad journalists like Politico's Alexander Ward is pumping out this anti-Russian propaganda, pieces that are literally paid for by Lockheed Martin, one of the worst of the military-industrial complex corporations. Shilling for the military-industrial complex is why not only Donald Trump, but now Joe Biden have funneled millions upon millions of your tax dollars to Ukraine for the purpose of buying weapons from who? U.S. military and war industry corporations. Those corporations who have bought up, not quite so overtly as they do in Ukraine, but here in the United States, the war industry has completely compromised U.S. politicians. We got a lot of corruption here too. So you got the war industry, the oil and gas industry, all these other interests. They've got their hooks in the mouths of these Ukrainian politicians, and they're collaborating together on this narrative that Russia is getting ready to invade, drive straight into Kiev, the capital, and overthrow Ukraine at any moment. So quick, sell us more weapons. But in the meantime, just route, because we need them fast, route tons and tons and tons of U.S.-made weapons to Ukraine from the neighboring NATO states that the USA has already armed. Route those weapons to Ukraine and then just pay the military-industrial complex corporations to resupply those other NATO nations. So this is a big feeding frenzy of corruption, and they'll use any narrative, even the false story that we are literally on the edge of World War III. They will use that kind of propaganda to scare everybody into lining the pockets of the corrupt war industry corporations and their dutiful political puppets. But what of the great one himself? What of the great savior of Ukraine? You've got Western media blowing the dog of war whistle about an imminent invasion by Russia. What is it that President Zelensky has to say about this supposed threat? Well, this week, Zelensky said this in a public address to his people, quote, "Now all news bulletins and the entire media landscape are dominated by similar messages about the war with Russia and the inevitable invasion which can start any minute. Those risks have existed for some time now, and they have not become any bigger." And he goes on to explain that the conflict with Russia, it's nothing new. He says what is happening right now, though, is that Russia is basically engaged in psychological warfare, trying to make Ukraine feel nervous, trying to get Ukraine to grant concessions to Russia based on this fear. He said this, quote, "Now they are actively attacking not our land, but your nerves. So you are constantly anxious, and they also attack the emotions of investors and our business environment to make Ukraine weaker, to make Ukraine make concessions. Don't help the enemy in a rush for hype. Repeating every day that the war will start will not prevent the war for sure. What should you do? Only one thing. Don't panic. Keep your head cool. Be self-confident. Don't overthink. React to things wisely without emotions." Now, you'd think that in this non-stop, wall-to-wall fear-mongering by the Western media about an imminent invasion of Ukraine, that they might stop and pay a little bit of attention to what the president of Ukraine himself has to say about the matter. But then again, messages about how the risk of conflict with Russia isn't getting any bigger than it has been all along, that doesn't really support the doesn't really support CNN's narrative, now does it? Ukraine's call to not overreact because of all these hyped up fears being promoted by the media. It's not exactly the kind of story that's going to bring in viewers to MSNBC or Fox News to increase their revenue from advertising. So let me tell you myself what is really going on. The West has been trying to surround Russia for decades by flipping former Soviet states, bringing them into NATO, so that the West can install troops and missile systems right there on Russia's doorstep. Try and box them in, kind of like a chess game. Putin has been griping about this trouble for years. It's nothing new. But here's what is different. Right now, he sees that America has got this senile president who has no backbone. He's got abysmal poll numbers, which indicates that few among his own party even truly support him. Putin knows that now is the best strategic time to play his hand, to try and push back against this decades-long Western encroachment on Russia and its influence in its own region. So he already had about 50,000 troops permanently stationed along the Russian border with Ukraine. He was already backing the ethnic Russian separatists in the Donbass region in this fight that has been going on for the last 8 years, where they're trying to retain autonomy from Kiev. He has seen the breakdown of previous treaties, such as Minsk I and II, that were supposed to address this ongoing trouble between Ukraine and Russia. So he's learned from this. He has seen diplomacy with the West doesn't work. So to him, it's clear that only a show of force is going to be taken seriously by the West. So Putin has beefed up his forces on the border. He has added tens of thousands more troops. He's moving in masses of tanks, heavy artillery, missile systems, so forth to the border. And he has announced basically that the era of westward expansion into Russia's backyard is over. He has made other demands, such as an agreement from the West that Ukraine will not be brought into NATO. Not now, not ever. He has demanded that the West pull back missile systems, remove them, other weapons, troops that they have deployed to other nations near Russia's border. He's not been threatening to invade Ukraine. He knows that doing so would be a really strategic blunder on his part, any kind of full-scale invasion. But he is using this buildup to, as Zelensky said, try to create psychological tension that will result in these Western concessions he's after. Neither Biden nor NATO currently has the will to respond militarily to Russia if Russia did carry out some kind of limited operation, such as one where they send in some troops to secure control of the Donbass, or some other type of smaller scale action, such as a cyber attack to disrupt Ukraine's banking system or infrastructure, such as their electrical grid. Russia's already done this in the past. Biden has made some rather weak promises about what he would do if Russia invaded. There would be sanctions, there would be a restriction on sale of tech to Russia, blah, 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 stuff Putin has been dealing with for years. And Biden even screwed up this week and said publicly that the USA definitely would not consider military action if all Putin did was just carry out kind of a limited military incursion into Ukraine. And that really pissed off the Ukrainians and NATO allies, and he had to walk back his statement. But that's where his mind is. We could talk about where Biden's mind is, but I digress. So Putin has got the upper hand right now. He's pushing hard for these concessions because he knows that he only has a temporary window in which he can pull off this bluff. He can't move hundreds of tanks, hundreds of personnel carriers with tens of thousands of troops and everything else he has sitting on the border. He can't move it into Ukraine for an invasion unless he times it right. The ground, I'm talking about just out there between in Donbass, the whole border between Ukraine and Russia. It has to be frozen over. It has to be frozen hard for all of this equipment to be able to drive over. And so the time frame for this, when this freezing usually happens, is between February, and it lasts through March. But beyond that, the ground thaws and they enter into what's called mud season. The wet ground would be turned into nothing but pools of mud under the tracks of Russia's tanks and other equipment. So this military option would become exceptionally more complicated by these environmental conditions beyond March. So Putin basically has this 2-month window to either get some concessions and then, magnanimously back down, or if everything completely fails and he gets nothing, he has to follow through and initiate movement into eastern Ukraine. Like I said, possibly to help shore up the Donbass region. But that's the situation in a nutshell. Clearly, I don't take the side of NATO, and I don't take the side of Vladimir Putin either on this. I think both sides are villainous, each in their own ways. My sympathies have always been with on the one hand, the ethnic Ukrainians in the West who have to deal with this corrupt government that is in bed with dangerous oligarchs, and who see these people who see Russia tearing away at the edges of their country, pulling off Crimea, exerting influence over Donbass. So my sympathies are there. My sympathies are also with the ethnic Russians who do live, and ethnic Russian Ukrainians over there in the east of Ukraine, who saw one puppet after another flipping back and forth between U.S. control or Russian control. They finally see this 2014 coup with the violent overthrow of their government. They say, screw it. Our government does not represent us. They kind of did what the early patriots in the United States did. They said, if the government's not going to support us, if it doesn't meet our interests, by golly, we have the God-given right to break away from that government. And that's what they did. They said, screw this political corruption in Kiev. And they formed their own autonomous region under the protection of Russia. And the consequence, though, is that they have had to spend the last 8 years living in a constant, perpetual state of warfare. So it's miserable for both sides of the people in this conflict. So I want to encourage my viewers, regardless of which side your own personal preferences might lie, remember that both sides, and I'm talking about NATO or Putin and Russia, both sides are bad options for the common people whose lives and liberties are being destroyed by this grand geopolitical chess match between the East and the West. So I hope you'll join me in praying for peace for the people in Ukraine, and speak out in social media in favor of diplomacy and try and keep tensions from simmering over. I don't believe Putin has any intention of any kind of massive invasion or anything, but things can change. Things can change depending on circumstances. And the West is certainly doing their part in trying to provoke him. They're trying to call his bluff. Anyway, if you enjoyed this report, thank you very much for your kind comments. You can also help fund my reports by going to either patreon.com/BlackstoneIntel or make a one-time donation at paypal.me/BlackstoneIntel. Checks, money orders, or other mail can be sent to Jake Morphonios, P.O. Box 1333, Kernersville, North Carolina 27285. Thank you guys for watching. Until next time, this has been Jake Morphonios with the Blackstone Intelligence Report.